The corporations of the world are often met by the public they provide for with skepticism and disdain. The shady practices of more than a few have given reason for this, and the murmurs of what goes on behind these corporations' closed doors would have people believe that things far more sinister than most could imagine happen. However, it is usually in the extremist of events we hear and see for ourselves what exactly happens or happened behind these doors. Of course, sometimes it is the work of a psychotic, immoral and greed-driven few within a company that push these doors shut and carry out their questionable work in secret. One such corporation whose top-level employees and work was inhumane to say the least, was eventually brought down thanks to an incident of their own making. One such cruel and former employee of the corporation played a horrifying role in the incident. One who saw to it that terrible pain was inflicted upon some, perhaps many individuals. He was an executive of the company that made him what he became, a homicidal self-proclaimed surgeon called Richard Traeger. Murkoff, a company dedicated to scientific research and development, to the point where it was willing to go beyond what is right and wrong for the sake of the leading position in science and medicine, but more importantly in their eyes, profit. Murkoff's research and development division headed the scientific projects that the company took on. This branch was eventually responsible for a project that would cause a horrifying event, causing severe damage to the company, at least financially. The project in question was one of great value to Murkoff, one that would see them make more money than some could possibly imagine from a single venture, Project Walrider. This was an experiment with the goal of creating a creature of the same name, the Walrider, also known as the Swarm. This ghostly figure, thought by many to be a spirit of another world, was in fact a swarm of small nanoscopic machines called nanites. As a collective, these incredibly tiny pieces of technology possess great strength and power, making it an almost unstoppable force and the perfect weapon against others. It was Murkoff's intent to control this swarm and allow it to become a sentient being. However, it was not as simple as using another piece of technology to control this collection of machines. In order for the Walrider to actually become a being, it needed a host, a human host, and a suitable one at that. Mount Massive Asylum, an institution for the criminally insane in Lake County, Colorado, USA, was the place where Project Walrider was born, and where Murkoff would get its test subjects in search for a suitable host. One Murkoff executive taking a role at Mount Massive and playing a part in the illegal experiments being conducted there was Richard "Rick" Traeger. Traeger was the head of business development at Mount Massive Asylum, and was partially responsible for the security of the facility. Before what was later known as the Mount Massive Asylum incident, he was being investigated by two of Murkoff's mitigation officers, whose job it was to minimise the damage caused following a mistake or oversight. Essentially, damage control. The investigation was triggered thanks to an anonymous email sent to Human Resources, complaining about the conditions at Mount Massive. This was quickly weeded out as a veiled threat, as one of the mitigation officers on the investigation, Pauline Glick, once called it. The officers were directed to Rick Traeger from a pregnant Murkoff employee, Michelle Haas, an IT specialist at Mount Massive, who stated that the anonymous email had to have been sent from corporate. Traeger acted all-heartedly when exchanging words with the mitigation officers, claiming that he was a team player. It was clear from his constant harassment towards Pauline that he was attracted to her, something she would eventually use to her advantage. However, in Rick's mind, an idea for how the two would come together was brewing, and it was an idea that was wrong on many levels. Richard claimed that no one in his department would benefit from vaguely threatening emails, essentially stating that everything was fine, which the mitigation officers quickly deduced that it was not. Traeger talked about the security budget cuts he had to make and how he had to create efficiencies that made them all safer. Pauline leapt at the opportunity to learn more from him and asked him to dinner, to which Richard, with a great smile on his face, accepted. Over 3 courses and a bottle of wine later that evening, Traeger conversed with Pauline and he told her of his father's words trying to convince him not to become a doctor. Eventually, he invited Glick back to his home where he first offered her cocaine, to which she turned down. He then offered her a 27-year-old Scotch, but wanting to nosy around Traeger's home, Pauline asked him for a red wine from his cellar. With Richard disappearing to fetch a bottle of red, Glick searched the home and found Rick's internet passwords, his stash of cocaine, a pamphlet for an abortion clinic, and magazine guides on how to perform surgery, something Traeger was and would become too gruesomely fascinated with. Richard soon brought up a bottle of French red and handed a glass over to Pauline. Around 20 minutes later, she recognised the bitter taste of a rohypnol-spiked drink and immediately pulled a gun on Traeger. She forced him to drink the rest of her wine, to which he passed out almost instantly after being pistol-whipped by the officer. Pauline then left with her partner after calling for him to pick her up. The two headed over to Michelle's house shortly afterwards. Pauline realised after seeing the abortion clinic pamphlet at Traeger's home that the pregnant Murkoff employee was the source of the email leak. Michelle revealed that the baby was Richard's, and that he told her to get rid of it, or face losing her job with no money coming in to look after the child. She sent the email in hopes that Traeger would be blamed and removed from Murkoff as a result. She couldn't outright reveal what he was doing, as that would have violated her non-disclosure agreement. Thus she would have been fired. A severance package for Michelle was made up in exchange for her silence, resulting in the eventual whistleblower Wayland Park temporarily taking up her position at Mount Massive. However, when she and the mitigation officers visited Jeremy Blair, Murkoff's executive vice president of global development and the head of Mount Massive Asylum and Project Walrider, Traeger stormed in the room and claimed Michelle couldn't prove anything. In what seemed like a desperate attempt to save himself, he grabbed a pair of nearby scissors and brutally stabbed her in the stomach. Michelle was severely wounded, and the baby likely dead. That is likely if there was a baby there in the first place. Paul Marion, Pauline's mitigation partner, attempted to wrestle Traeger to the ground, trying to stab Paul. Richard instead accidentally stabbed himself in the leg. Pauline then grabbed him by the head and slammed him down on the floor. Before he was able to stab her with the scissors he still held, she drove his head into a nearby paper shredder. With his hair caught in the machine, Pauline switched it on, and most of his long strands were ripped from his skull, scarring his scalp in the process. He was soon apprehended and committed by Murkoff themselves to Mount Massive Asylum, where he would become a subject to its grand experiment. Beneath the asylum was the laboratory that housed the morphogenic engine, a process that allowed mentally ill individuals to control the Walrider. The catch for this engine was that only those who had seen enough horror could become the host, and so Murkoff took mentally ill people in the asylum for treatment. Only many never came out. Over the course of several years from 2009, Murkoff conducted illegal, immoral experiments on the patients there, under the guise of a charitable organisation, trying desperately to find that perfect host. But for probably a very specific reason, or maybe reasons, Project Walrider did not include female patients. The experiment supposedly required male reproductive organs, but eventually, female staff were removed completely from Mount Massive Asylum. The problem was that one of the side effects of the experiments down below the institution was that some of the women working there suffered from psychosomatic pregnancies. The feeling and physical symptoms of being pregnant were present, only the baby itself wasn't. This is exactly what became of Michelle, who fortunately survived Traeger's attack. As the number of women working within Mount Massive with the same condition increased, Murkoff eventually reassigned all female employees to other facilities, though not for the benefit of the women, but to save the company from the potentially huge lawsuits. However, there was another more horrible side effect of the morphogenic engine. Those subjected to the experiment underwent sanity-depleting therapy before being put through the, what you could call, final process. This sent many insane, and those who already were more so, and the subjects that were unsuccessful in the experiment had rapidly forming lesions and tumour-like growths as a result, while also being descended into complete and utter madness. Richard Traeger was put through all this, and Pauline Glick and Jeremy Blair, who was a friend and apparent golf partner of Rick, personally watched as he was dragged into the morphogenic engine, kicking and screaming, probably knowing full well the fate that awaited him. Likely not long afterwards, while Mount Massive was still operational and conducting experiments, there was a leak in Murkoff. An email from one of the IT employees at the asylum, later revealed to be Wayland Park, was sent to a journalist called Miles UPSHUR. The email stated that illegal ventures were going on at the asylum, and that what was happening there needed to be exposed. Miles set out to investigate and craft what he anticipated would be quite a hefty story. Little did he know, he wouldn't be the one to break it. Shortly before Miles arrived at the facility, the Mount Massive Asylum incident erupted. This event was a massacre of the staff and patients at the institution. In Murkoff's attempt to make Project Walrider a success, they instead made it into a huge mistake, a nightmare difficult to comprehend. They had found a more than too suitable host for the Walrider, a man who was sold to Murkoff by his own mother, Billy Hope. Hope had made excellent progress with the project, and eventually gained control of the Walrider, and proceeded to slaughter the staff and patients of Mount Massive Asylum. The facility was rapidly engulfed in chaos. Many of the what Murkoff staff referred to as variants, inmates and patients that inhabited the asylum, escaped and began to partake in the senseless slaughter that was happening all around Mount Massive. The security personnel desperately attempted to stop the ensuing chaos, but ultimately failed. Thus, an emergency evacuation was called. Murkoff dispatched to the facility their very own tactical division, private military contractors with the goal of rescuing a highly valued scientist and securing the institution, ensuring no one within left with tales of the horror or impulses to harm others. 2 groups of mercenaries entered Mount Massive, but neither of them left it. And so by the time Miles UPSHUR arrived, the facility was completely taken by the inmates, and the Walrider was loose. Richard Traeger, however, survived the initial chaos and had a strange idea: to make money. Like many of the asylum's patients, Traeger was now a savage, murdering psychopath. But unlike many of the other variants, he still had a sense of reality and a bit more intelligence, capable of taking a moment to think and plan, as well as speak in a more reasonable tone. The peculiar thing about this new Traeger was that his personality seemed to be somewhat intact following his experience with Project Walrider. He was a friendly character, always joking around, and hardly ever losing his self-control, but that would all change when things didn't go his way, as they didn't when the Murkoff mitigation officers got involved with him and Michelle Haas, as well as when Miles UPSHUR escaped his grasp. During the incident, Traeger set up shop in Mount Massive's male ward, made himself into a surgeon, and began cutting up the inhabitants unlucky enough to be caught in his net. One of his victims was apparently an ex-Murkoff executive just like him, that also underwent treatment via the morphogenic engine. It seemed that from his ramblings as he cut up various inhabitants and wandered the halls and rooms of the male ward, Traeger was obsessed with making money, specifically profiting from the sale of human body parts, though supposedly he cut the tongue from one of the inhabitants simply because he was tired of licking his own stamps. Thanks to being a part of the Walrider experiment, Traeger, like many others, was disfigured. He became a very bony and decayed man. In his effort to make himself a surgeon, or perhaps in his insanity he thought he was one, he crafted a makeshift apron out of what appeared to be dark green bedsheets and wore a worn-out surgeon's mask. He also somehow managed to either obtain or create and wear steampunk-style glasses with broken lenses. But the most peculiar thing about his physical appearance was the patient drip wrapped around his left arm. It may have been left there after having a drip attached prior to the incident, or maybe it was actually keeping him alive. But then, there's always the likely chance it was just a fiendish decoration. Then again, it could have very well been a tool Richard kept on hand to drain the blood of others, ready for sale in his somewhat imaginary world. When Miles Upshur became trapped in Mount Massive, he eventually found himself in the male ward being chased by a number of the asylum's patients. Hearing a voice calling for him to jump into the dumbwaiter in the room housing it, Miles clambered inside and was sent upwards away from the pursuing variants. Little did Miles know that the voice calling from above was that of Richard Traeger. Traeger trapped Miles and beat him so he was unable to walk. He strapped the journalist to a wheelchair and began pushing him back to the section of the male ward where Rick had been carrying out his barbaric acts. As they rode onwards through the asylum, Rick taunted Miles and joked around until arriving at a bloody bathroom he had turned into a makeshift operating room. After setting down Miles' camcorder, washing his hands and having a small talk about religion and another patient called Father Martin, Richard proceeded to cut off two of the journalist's fingers with a large pair of rusty bone shears. For one reason or another, Traeger then left the room, leaving Upshur the opportunity to break free, which he did, and was soon informed of Richard's former status as a Murkoff executive by the other, supposedly former executive Rick had strapped to a bed in another room. This supposed ex-executive partially revealed to Miles the Walrider's existence, referring to the ghostly swarm as it, but he soon began warning him of Traeger, and shouting the psychopath's last name, to which the mad self-made surgeon appeared to investigate. Before long, after killing the shouting victim and discovering Miles had escaped, Traeger was on a hunt for the journalist, and he was furious at this situation, calling Miles a quitter and stating that he hated quitters. As the psychotic Traeger searched the area for his escaped victim, Miles found a key to the elevator that brought him up to Rick's den of cruelty. Richard, realizing Upshur was descending in the elevator, broke into it from the floor below and attempted to grab Miles, but the journalist struggled and managed to push him out as the elevator continued downwards. However, Traeger wasn't entirely pushed out. As the struggle led to Miles falling back into the elevator as it was already halfway down from its entrance, Richard too fell forward in a desperate attempt to get Upshur, but it was too late. His upper torso remained in the elevator as it went down, almost passing the entrance completely. Traeger was crushed to death, stopping the elevator in the process, and forcing Miles to escape via a hatch in the ceiling. And so, abruptly comes the end of the story of Richard Traeger. But not quite. That is, if you count one's own corpse as a part of the story. Sometime following Miles UPSHUR's narrow escape from the clutches of the self-made surgeon, more Murkoff mercenaries arrived, and the big cleanup began. PMC teams swept through the asylum, killing variants and hunting those who had seen too much. They found the body of Richard Traeger, and pulled it from the elevator he was crushed in. Some would say it's somewhat unfortunate that they mistook him for a victim of the incident. But then again, the madman was in turn a victim of Murkoff's cruel experiment. The real villain at the end of it all is not always the monster created, but the creator themselves. Even though old Rick was a sadist before his treatment. Regardless, Rick Traeger was dead. His probable constant torture of others was over, and the memory of this evil human being and his actions faded. Well, that is if his story was not embedded and passed on into the minds of others. That and Michelle Haas's experience, one she most definitely did not forget. Then there's also the unlikely possibility that old Rick Traeger could somehow return. Who knows what other experiments lay or laid in Murkoff's store of immoral projects. So if you're ever visiting a surgeon or mental institution, try not to think of Richard Traeger. Though if there is a lesson he himself can teach us, what his encounter with Miles UPSHUR can teach us, it is to remember that a friendly voice from afar may not be from the mouth of someone whose actions match their tone. To put it simply, don't trust the friendly voice, because you never know what sort of character it comes from.